Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are listening to this. My name is Ivory. I am the curator for Embracing Neurodiversity, and this is our podcast. It is about 7 a.m., and I like to get up a little early before my son just to kind of have time to myself and drink my coffee and listen to my thoughts. But obviously, also, I wanted to record this podcast for this week. As I mentioned in my introduction in the first episode, it wasn't really quite an episode, but in the introduction, my intention with this podcast is to create a space for parents who have children on the spectrum or who have neurodivergent children to feel seen and heard. That's intention number one. And then my second intention is to discuss aloud and reflect on my journey with my 6-year-old brilliant child who is on the spectrum. I think oftentimes as parents with children who are neurodivergent, we tend to internalize a lot of our thoughts and emotions and about how we are experiencing this process, both the good moments and the not so good moments, right? We kind of keep it to ourselves because being a parent to a child on the spectrum is a very unique experience, one that is oftentimes hard to articulate, and one that is oftentimes difficult to understand if you're not walking in that very specific experience, right? And so for me, someone who is naturally private and sort of keeps her thoughts and emotions to herself, unless I feel really passionate about something, I wanted to be able to push myself out of my comfort zone to talk about my experience as a mother to a child on the spectrum. And so that's broad, but it's going to get very detailed about what it has been for me as a Black mother to a Black male child on the spectrum, and also what it is like for me as a single mother to a child who is on the spectrum. And so we know that statistically 1 in 44 people have a diagnosis of being on the autism spectrum, right? We also know that children of color are diagnosed less, and so statistically that number could be more. But either way, if we know that that is the statistic, then we know that more people than than we may realize experience parenting on the spectrum. And so you're going to hear my son in the background because he just woke up. But I say all that to say that if you are looking for a podcast that is going to discuss the scientific process of what autism is and what neurodiversity is and the quote-unquote ways that it can be cured, which it cannot, by the way. But if you're looking for those type of discussions, then this is not the podcast for you. If you are looking for a podcast that is going to be perfect in terms of its cadence and its dialogue, then this is not the podcast for you. I'm a huge podcast listener. I love storytelling, and my intention is to tell my story, but I don't seek to perfection. I seek impact. And so, with that being said, today I wanted to talk about the day I found out my son had autism, or I should say the day that he received his diagnosis, right? So my son is 6 years old. It's currently December 2022, and my son and I received his diagnosis on March 2022. So not it hasn't yet been a year, but before we received official medical diagnosis, like many parents, if you're listening to this, you can probably relate. I had a little inkling, right? My son's speech was delayed, and even though he was going to speech therapy, and honestly, a couple years prior to that, the first speech pathologist told me and his dad that they didn't see any signs of autism, even though I, got that input. I still sort of had an inkling, but for the most part, he didn't show any major signs, and so I just kept working with him in his speech and his language, and everything that he needed to know as a child who was 3, 4, 5 years old, right? Because this is when I started to get that inkling. And so he was 5 when he got his diagnosis. And so he was actually on the waiting list for a long time. And that says a lot about people who are actually, or parents who are actually have that same inkling, and perhaps are making appointments to get an evaluation and are waiting. And so Khalil was on the wait list, I want to say, for over almost a year, honestly. Like I believe over 6 months for sure. I believe I made the appointment when he was 4 in the summer of maybe 2021. And we didn't actually get to have an appointment until almost a year later. And so with that, the neurologist, she was so delightful, so compassionate. Khalil, which is my son's name, took to her very quickly during the appointment, in terms of engaging with her. Like, she bent down and was eye level with him, and those type of characteristics are important. So parents, please watch out for that when you are working with health professionals, how they engage with your child and acknowledge them and treat them like human beings is essential to this process. And so she was very much so someone who engaged with Khalil as if he was a human being. Oftentimes kids get treated like they're not human, and so as a result, Khalil took well to her. So she was incorporating a couple of evaluation strategies, like flashcards and floor play, to see what he knows and how he responds to things, and some things he knew, some things he didn't. And she asked me a bunch of questions about his history. She did a physical evaluation on him as well. And so all of this took about an hour and a half. And afterwards, she, came back into the room and, sat with me and said, "So he does have autism." And immediately I felt a very unique feeling of relief and sadness, right? I don't know if anyone can relate to that, but it's this idea of something that you kind of sort of know or have a feeling of, but you don't have the proof or the expertise to know for sure. You get it confirmed. There's a level of relief because now you don't have to be in the dark or confused, right? But then obviously there was a level of sadness because with getting a diagnosis, you have these flood of fears and anxieties about will my child ever be able to function independently in the world? Will he ever be able to have a healthy social life? Will he be able to comprehend information and educational material in the way that will allow him to thrive in the world? Like, ultimately, my fear initially was and has been, is he going to be able to thrive in this world, right? And so with those mixed emotions, when she finally told me, I started to cry. And it's so funny, if I set up the scene, like, we were sitting on the floor, and the reason we were sitting on the floor, the neurologist, myself, and Khalil, is because Khalil, after an hour and a half of being in this small room, he kept trying to elope. And elope means just like running unexpectedly. So he kept trying to leave out the room, right? And so we had to sit on the floor and sit up by the door to ensure he wouldn't. So we're all sitting on the floor, and I started to cry. And she told me, I'll never forget this. She said, it's going to be okay. I wish I can give you a glass ball so that you can see the future, because lots of people are on the spectrum and they are living full lives. She said that she has physician friends who are on the spectrum. Like, this is not a end-all be-all. And then she commenced to tell me the steps that I needed to begin to take in order to get the ball moving, to get him in a position to begin to thrive, right? That's the only word I can really use in terms of, like, to get him to a place where he it doesn't have a lot of barriers in place. And so the three things that I needed to do immediately, or actually he was already in speech therapy, I already had that in place, but I had to work on getting him ABA therapy, that's applied behavior analysis, and we can talk about that a little bit later. And then I had to also look into if he needed occupational therapy as well, in addition to social work therapy, right? And so after the diagnosis, I again left feeling very somber and sad, and that was really just kind of sad and overwhelmed. I was tired too, like I was exhausted just from a lot of things that had been going on during that time in both of our lives. But I got in the car, and I remember the first thought is to call one of my friends who I know who has a child who is on the spectrum, and I just wanted to get her encouragement and to like hear some rational thoughts. And she did that for me. Like, she told me that it was going to be fine, and reiterated the next steps, right? And so I took a deep breath and put on some gospel music and started to drive home, and started to encourage myself and tell myself, like, okay, we can do this. And I got on that journey. And so got on that journey of like making appointments, and that in itself is a huge long journey, which actually we'll talk about next episode. But I often think back on that day because it's sort of like a fork in the road for Khalil and myself. When you receive a diagnosis for your child, you have oftentimes one or two options. You either embrace it as reality, and then you get busy putting the services in place, or you get in denial and you choose to ignore it. And I empathize with that, right? Because you don't want to feel that your child has some sort of deficit or disorder, which I hate those terms with a passion, but those are the terms that people use in this world of neurodivergency, or in this world of this medical world, is particularly as it relates to developmental processes, right? But I hate those terms because when I see my child, I don't see a deficit, I don't see a disorder, I don't see any of that. I simply see a brilliant, bright, vibrant, active child who happens to be on the spectrum. And so, but going back to that, the two things that routes you can take. When you choose to ignore it or you're in denial, like it's a tool to protect yourself because it's painful to learn that your child has this unique experience that oftentimes will create barriers for them, and it's not because of who they are, it's because of society, and society has not yet got to a place where it has come a long way, and for the most part, Khalil and I navigate the world and systems quite relatively fine, but society still hasn't gotten to a place where people on the spectrum can exist and move about without having some level or some barrier in place, right? And so, anyway, go off my tangent. When you choose to be in denial and or to ignore, it delays the process for you and your child to fully live in the truth. And in living in the truth, you're able to create beautiful experiences, because the journey, there's no perfect journey, there's no template for this life. And so by embracing it, yeah, there are going to be rough times, but there are also going to be celebratory times when you see your child hit a milestone, or you see your child use a word or a statement that you hadn't heard before. And so in many ways, when you choose to ignore or deny the diagnosis, and you're denying a part of who your child is, or what your child is experiencing. And even though that's not the intent, that is certainly the impact. And so I want to encourage any parent out there who received a diagnosis or may think that their child has autism and may be getting an evaluation soon, to take it a moment at a time, to not see the diagnosis as a deficit or a sort of like a stamp on your child, and that this is the end. I want to encourage you to see it as an opportunity to then begin to get on the journey of getting your child the services that they need, and creating a village for yourself and your child. It won't be easy, but it will be rewarding if you are open to it. In many ways, a diagnosis for me represented a roadmap, right? Because they give you documents on the next steps and list of services. And again, we'll talk about next week the process of getting services, because it is a shit show. But at least now you have this roadmap, right? And so whatever you do for self-care, like, always engage in that. But please embrace the experience as a beautiful one, because that is oftentimes what is the difference between your child thriving in this world. So with that being said, thank you for taking out the time to listen. And I hope that even if you're not a parent with a child on the spectrum, but you are a family member or someone who's just curious about this, I hope that it provided some level of insight for you. So until next time, please support us. Our website is Neurodiversity Embrace. Our Instagram is Embracing Neurodiversity, and our Facebook is the same name. I hope you have a wonderful day.